On the morning of December 14, 2023, a woman returned home to a quiet suburban house in Broomfield, Colorado. She had just dropped two of her children at school. She pulled into the garage, and according to prosecutors, someone was already waiting for her. Within minutes, Daniel Krug would be unconscious on the garage floor. She had suffered multiple blows to the head. Then, according to the prosecution's case, she was stabbed in the heart. But the most disturbing part of this case wasn't simply what happened inside that garage. It was what had been happening for weeks before it, because Kristil believed someone was stalking her. She was receiving threatening messages, emails, photographs, messages that suggested someone was watching where she went. Someone even appeared to know that she had been to the dentist. And Kristil had a name in mind: her ex-boyfriend. But there was one problem. He wasn't the person sending the messages. He was hundreds of miles away, and as investigators would eventually discover, the person hiding behind the fake identity was much closer to Kristil than anyone could have imagined. He was her husband, Daniel Krug, and what initially looked like a terrifying stalking case would eventually become something far more sinister. A murder investigation, a case built around deception, digital evidence, surveillance footage, and a husband who prosecutors said had created an imaginary enemy so he could become his wife's protector. But when that plan failed, investigators said Daniel turned to something much more permanent. He killed her. And then, according to prosecutors, he tried to make it look as though she was still alive. Several weeks before Kristil's death, something had changed. The messages began appearing in October 2023. At first, they were disturbing. Then, they became threatening. Kristil told investigators that someone was contacting her while pretending to be Anthony Holland, a former boyfriend. The messages suggested the sender knew things about her life, things a random stranger shouldn't know. And then came a photograph, a picture of Daniel getting out of his vehicle at work. That was the moment the situation became much more serious. Kristil believed someone wasn't simply sending random messages. Someone was watching them. She eventually went to the Broomfield Police Department and spoke with Detective Andrew Martinez. And during that interview, Kristil explained exactly how frightened she had become. She told him the purpose of the messages seemed obvious. They were meant to terrorize her. The harassment continued. And then came another message. Someone claimed they had seen her at the dentist. To investigators, that detail was significant, because whoever was behind the messages appeared to know where Kristil had been. This wasn't simply someone sending insults from behind a screen. It looked like someone was watching her movements. And Kristil began changing the way she lived. She deleted social media accounts. She kept records of the messages. She became increasingly concerned about her safety. Her mother even installed surveillance cameras around the home because of the stalking. At this point, police were investigating a threat against Kristil. They didn't know they were also looking at the beginning of a murder plot. The messages pointed investigators toward Anthony Holland. Kristil believed he was responsible, and initially that made sense. He had been part of her past. There was history between them. But detectives needed evidence. So they began working to identify the person actually controlling the accounts and sending the messages. And slowly, the investigation began revealing something strange. The digital trail didn't lead where investigators expected. An email account connected to the harassment had been created through the computer network at Daniel Krug's workplace. Then there was a burner phone. The phone used in connection with some of the messages had been purchased using a gift card registered to Daniel. And investigators noticed something else. The burner phone repeatedly appeared in the same general area as Daniel's own phone. One piece of evidence could be explained away. Two pieces could be coincidence. But investigators were beginning to see a pattern, and that pattern pointed directly toward the husband. Still, they had to be careful, because Daniel was not supposed to be the victim's stalker. He was supposed to be the person protecting her from one. That distinction would become critical, because prosecutors later argued that Daniel had created the entire threat. The theory was chillingly simple. Scare Kristil. Make her believe an old boyfriend was coming after her, then become the person she depended on for protection. A manufactured enemy, a manufactured hero, and Daniel would be standing in the middle of both. Prosecutors later described him as a kind of puppet master. But there was a problem with the plan. Kristil wasn't coming back to him. She was becoming more suspicious. And, according to prosecutors, she was beginning to consider the possibility that Daniel himself could be behind the stalking. By late 2023, the Krug marriage was deteriorating. Prosecutors argued that Daniel desperately wanted to maintain control over the relationship. But Kristil was moving in another direction. The stalking wasn't bringing them closer. It was doing the opposite. She was documenting what was happening. She was speaking to police. And she was trying to understand who was behind it. Investigators later learned that Kristil had confronted Daniel about the possibility that he was the stalker. Daniel acknowledged to detectives that she had told him she couldn't rule him out. He denied it. But now there was a problem. If Kristil kept investigating, the person behind the fake identity could eventually be exposed. And if prosecutors were correct, Daniel was running out of time. Then came December 14th, the morning everything changed.
A name she hasn't thought about in more than 20 years.
Kristil got her
Jack
children ready.
Anthony Holland, a man she dated briefly as a teenager.
She returned home.
The message is short,
crude,
completely out of nowhere. Hi, Kristil. It's Anthony. Hope it's okay I looked you up. I go to Boulder every few weeks and thought we could hook up. You game? At first, she didn't think much of it. The two last spoke years ago, and even then, he was harmless. So she ignores it and moves on. But the next day, everything changes. Are you there? You should say yes when I offer pity. Whatever. I saw your pics. You got fat. You should yourself. Saw you at the dentist today. Your license plate expired. Gotta fix that. Suddenly, Kristil's fear becomes reality, and she begins living with the terrifying possibility that she's being watched. And now, she's certain Anthony is the one who's been harassing her for weeks. She becomes hypervigilant, installs cameras around the home, dash cams in her car, and starts carrying a concealed handgun everywhere she goes. By late October, Kristil's barely sleeping. She keeps a spreadsheet of her stalker log, documenting every message she gets. Then, almost a month later, a new email from Anthony confirms her worst fears.
But on the morning Kristil was killed, the cameras weren't functioning normally. Prosecutors said Daniel disabled the home's security system. The garage camera was covered with blue masking tape. Investigators later determined that the tape came from a kitchen drawer. And surveillance footage captured Daniel leaving the house at approximately 8:24 a.m. That was unusual. He normally left earlier. According to prosecutors, he was leaving roughly 30 minutes later than his usual departure time. But if investigators only looked at the time Daniel left, they might have believed Kristil was still alive, because messages would soon appear to come from her phone. At approximately 8:56 a.m., texts were sent from Kristil's phone, messages that prosecutors said Daniel had arranged in advance. The purpose? To create the appearance that Kristil was still using her phone after he had supposedly left. But digital forensic investigators would eventually discover something Daniel couldn't hide. Kristil's phone had not actually been used after approximately 8:22 a.m. The messages had been delayed. They weren't proof that Kristil was alive. They were evidence of an attempt to make her look alive. And suddenly, the timeline began collapsing. After leaving the house, Daniel drove toward work. But investigators would later notice another unusual detail. His vehicle's dash camera had been deactivated shortly before he stopped for coffee and continued toward his workplace. Again, individually, that might not prove murder. But investigators were no longer looking at individual facts. They were assembling a sequence. A wife being stalked, a fake identity, a burner phone, digital evidence connecting the harassment to Daniel, a surveillance system disabled on the morning of the killing, a garage camera covered with tape. Daniel leaving later than usual, messages scheduled to appear as though Kristil was alive, and then Daniel arriving at work at approximately 9:27 a.m. From there, he began contacting Kristil. Calls, texts, no response, and around noon, Daniel called Broomfield Police. He asked for a welfare check. At first, that could look like the behavior of a worried husband, but investigators were about to discover why the welfare check was so important. Because when officers arrived at the home at approximately 12:28 p.m., they found Kristil in the garage. She was unconscious. There were obvious signs of severe trauma, and she had been stabbed. She was dead. Daniel returned to the scene, and investigators watched him. He was emotional. He was devastated. He insisted that someone else had done this, and according to later reporting, he repeatedly focused investigators on the idea that the real killer was still out there. But detectives were already looking at him differently. The stalking investigation had changed everything. The person Kristil believed was stalking her was already becoming a suspect in her murder, and investigators now had to ask the question that would define the entire case. Was the stalking campaign connected to the killing, or were these two separate crimes? Daniel had an explanation. He suggested the ex-boyfriend could be responsible, but police checked. Anthony Holland was in Utah. He had an alibi. He was approximately 8 hours away. The man Kristil thought was threatening her couldn't have been inside that garage when she was killed. The supposed stalker was innocent. So investigators returned to the messages. Who had actually been sending them? This is where the case became less about fingerprints and more about data. Because Daniel had tried to hide behind technology, but technology was also what investigators used to find him. The email account, the burner phone, the location information, the messages, the searches, the timing. Piece by piece, investigators began reconstructing what had happened. And the deeper they went, the harder it became to separate the stalking case from Daniel. Prosecutors argued that Daniel had created a false identity and used it to terrorize his own wife. The goal, they said, wasn't initially to kill her. It was to control her, to frighten her, to make her feel unsafe without him. And then, once she depended on him, he could become the person who protected her from the threat he had created. But Kristil didn't play the role he had planned for her. She went to police. She kept records. She investigated. She became suspicious. And that meant the fake stalker was no longer simply a psychological weapon. It had become a trail leading back toward Daniel. As detectives continued working, they confronted Daniel, and according to later accounts, he insisted that they were looking at the wrong person. He maintained that another man had killed Kristil. But investigators weren't satisfied. They knew the ex-boyfriend was nowhere near Colorado. They knew the cameras had been disabled. They knew Kristil's phone had been manipulated. They knew messages had been sent after the time investigators believed she had already been killed. And they knew the stalking investigation had repeatedly pointed toward Daniel. At one point, Detective Andrew Martinez confronted Daniel with the possibility that the biggest threat to Kristil may have been inside the home. The implication was devastating. The person Kristil feared might not have been outside at all. It might have been the person sleeping under the same roof. Daniel denied killing her. He denied being the stalker, and he continued to insist that investigators find the person responsible. In one recorded interaction, Daniel expressed anger toward the supposed killer and demanded that police keep looking. But investigators were already looking, just not where Daniel wanted them to. There was one major problem for prosecutors. The murder weapons were never found. The blunt object was missing. The knife was missing. And the defense would repeatedly emphasize another problem. There was no blood found on Daniel's clothing, no blood found in his vehicle, and no direct DNA evidence placing Daniel at the center of the attack. The defense argued that the prosecution had built a case around assumptions. They questioned the investigation. They questioned the lack of forensic evidence, and they argued that police had failed to properly investigate other possibilities. This was important. because the case wasn't going to be decided by one smoking gun. There wasn't going to be a murder weapon suddenly appearing in a dumpster. There wasn't going to be a perfect fingerprint. There wasn't going to be DNA that ended every argument. Instead, prosecutors were asking the jury to look at the entire timeline: the stalking, the deception, the digital evidence, the surveillance cameras, the phone, the delayed messages, the marriage, the motive, and the morning Kristil died. One piece might not be enough, but prosecutors believed all of them together told one story. The prosecution's theory of motive was built around control. According to prosecutors, Daniel's marriage was falling apart. Kristil was no longer responding to him the way he wanted. So he created an enemy. Someone she could fear. Someone he could supposedly protect her from. But the plan backfired. Instead of pulling Kristil closer, it pushed her toward law enforcement. And eventually, prosecutors said, Kristil began suspecting the truth. That created a new problem. If she identified Daniel as the person behind the stalking, he could face consequences. And if she left him, he would lose the relationship he was trying to control. The prosecution argued that Daniel reached a point where he believed he had nothing left to lose. And on December 14, 2023, he waited for Kristil in the garage. Then he attacked. The prosecution described it as an ambush. Kristil never saw it coming. Daniel Krug was eventually charged with first-degree murder, 2 counts of stalking, and criminal impersonation. But prosecutors still had to prove their case. And the defense came prepared to attack the investigation. They pointed to the absence of physical evidence. They questioned why Kristil's phone had not been tested for fingerprints or DNA. They emphasized that an unknown person's DNA was found on tape associated with the garage camera. And they argued that the lack of blood or DNA connecting Daniel directly to the murder created reasonable doubt. The defense's message was straightforward. Suspicion wasn't proof. A complicated digital trail wasn't the same thing as a murder weapon, and an unhappy marriage wasn't proof of murder. But prosecutors had another message. The evidence didn't exist in isolation. It connected. The stalking connected to Daniel. The fake identity connected to Daniel. The burner phone connected to Daniel. The digital activity connected to Daniel. The security cameras connected to Daniel. And the strange phone activity after Kristil's death connected to the timeline prosecutors had reconstructed. The question was no longer simply, did Daniel have a motive? It was, how many coincidences can exist before they stop being coincidences? During the trial, jurors heard about the disturbing messages Kristil had received. They heard about her fear. They heard about her meeting with police. They heard about the possibility that she had begun suspecting her husband. And they heard the prosecution's theory that Daniel had tried to construct an entire alternate reality around her. A stalker who wasn't really there. A threat that came from someone pretending to be someone else. A danger that Daniel could then supposedly rescue her from. But beneath that elaborate story was something much simpler. Control. And when the control began slipping away, prosecutors argued, Daniel changed the plan. The stalking wasn't working. Kristil wasn't returning to him. Police were getting closer, and she was beginning to see through the deception. So the fake stalker disappeared, and the real killer stepped forward. The jury began deliberating. For Daniel, the entire case now came down to 12 people deciding whether the circumstantial evidence was enough. There was no murder weapon, no direct eyewitness to the attack, no single piece of forensic evidence that independently solved the case. But there was the timeline. And after approximately a day and a half of deliberations, the jury returned. The verdicts were guilty. First-degree murder, stalking with a credible threat, criminal impersonation. Daniel Krug had been convicted on every charge, and the person prosecutors said had spent months hiding behind a fake identity was now facing the consequences of the real one. On April 18, 2025, Daniel Krug was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for Kristil's murder. He also received an additional 9.5 years for the stalking and criminal impersonation convictions. The judge determined the crimes constituted domestic violence. Kristil's family spoke about the devastating consequences, because this case didn't simply take one life, it destroyed a family. Kristil was a mother of 3. Her children were left without their mother, and the man convicted of killing her was their father. The same man prosecutors said had created the fake stalker, the same man who had allegedly tried to manipulate Kristil's fear, the same man who had been inside the house when she died. But even after the verdict, Daniel continued to maintain that he was innocent. He continued to insist that someone else killed Kristil. And after his conviction, he reportedly told his family that the real killer remained at large and that his children could still be in danger. But the jury had already reached its conclusion. The man Kristil believed was stalking her had been identified. The man she once suspected was behind the messages had been convicted. And the fake identity that had terrified her for weeks had finally been exposed. There was no mysterious stranger waiting outside the house, no unknown ex-boyfriend coming back for revenge. The person prosecutors said had been pulling the strings was already inside Kristil's life. And perhaps that is what makes this case so disturbing. Because the danger didn't begin when the garage door opened that morning. It began weeks earlier, with a message, then another, a photograph, a threat, a fake name, a burner phone, a manufactured stalker, and a woman slowly realizing that someone knew far too much about her. Kristil went to police because she believed someone was watching her. She was right. But she was looking in the wrong direction. The person watching her wasn't hiding across the street. He wasn't waiting in a dark parking lot. He wasn't some stranger from her past. According to the prosecution's case, he was the man she came home to, her husband, Daniel Krug. And by the time investigators understood what had really been happening, Kristil was already dead. The stalking case had become a murder case. The imaginary stalker had become a real suspect. And the elaborate deception Daniel allegedly created to control his wife became the very trail that investigators used to find him. In the end, it wasn't one piece of evidence that brought the case down. It was the story all of those pieces told together. A story about obsession, a story about control, and a man who prosecutors said tried to manufacture a threat so convincing that his own wife would never realize where the danger was actually coming from. Until it was too late. Daniel Krug was convicted of first-degree murder, stalking, and criminal impersonation, and he will spend the rest of his life in prison without the possibility of parole. Kristil's family will spend theirs without her, and the messages that once made her wonder who was watching her now remain one of the darkest pieces of evidence in a case where the stalker was never who she thought he was.